Welcome back everybody to another episode of Direct Comparison. In today's episode, we're going to take a look at the open beta that ran this past weekend for the hotly anticipated Battlefield 2042, and see how it stacks up both in terms of its visuals and its general gameplay mechanics to the fan favorite Battlefield 4. Before we get started, it's important to understand that 2042, as it's shown here, is still in its beta phase. In fact, the developers have stated multiple times that the build that was used for this open beta test was at least 3 months old. Because of this, we should in theory see a drastically different launch experience for this game when it's made available for early adopters on November 12th. So, any graphical bugs, performance issues, or general gameplay design elements could potentially change before then. Also, because Battlefield 4 came out way back in 2013 and served as a launch title for the previous console generation, it's to be expected that Battlefield 2042 will look more impressive from a visual standpoint. So, while I will still discuss the visuals briefly, I want to spend more time discussing the gameplay design, and we'll save a more in-depth visual analysis for closer to launch, with a look at how DICE has improved over their previous title, Battlefield 5. For reference, both games are being played on a PC, outputting at a native 4K resolution, with the graphics settings cranked up to their highest values. However, I will be disabling the motion blur options to enable cleaner image capture. So let's kick this comparison off by going over the presentation, starting with the design of the character models. Now, this is an area that I feel needs quite a bit of work right out of the gate. Setting aside the whole specialist system, that yes, I will expand upon more in a bit, the actual level of quality and complexity incorporated into these 4 models in this build is just disappointing, leading me to believe that maybe some of the settings in the menus may not actually be activated for this beta. The textures on the uniforms, for example, are really muddy when compared to the nicely crisp detail shown on the uniforms in 4, and other facial features like eyes, skin, and hair just feel off. Battlefield 4's models have no doubt seen better days, especially when you stop to look closely at their simple-looking facial geometry. But the textures still hold up remarkably well, and there's so much great detail along each of these uniforms. What's more, the character models are unique to each faction available in the game, whereas in the Battlefield 2042 beta, there's quite literally only 4 character models. 6 if you include the pilot models used in vehicles and whatever these AI models are supposed to be. This means that regardless of what team you play on, your character model will always look the same, requiring players to rely solely on the user interface to identify threats versus friendlies. It's a really odd design choice, but again, we'll get into the specifics of that later. Another problem area with Battlefield 2042's presentation is its player animations. This is something that stood out to me right away when playing the beta, as I feel it really takes away from the immersion of the experience. Something about the way that the weapon sways on the screen when running feels incredibly unnatural, almost as if the player is trying to sprint into battle wearing high heels. The weapon sways back and forth rapidly with this jarring redirection that completely kills the flow of the movement. In Battlefield 4, the movement feels more fluid and natural, with the weapon more steadily swaying across the screen and then flowing seamlessly when initiating more complex motions like vaulting. I think by improving this animation loop, players will immediately feel more comfortable with Battlefield 2042's general feel, as it's something that no doubt contributes to the game's really awkward feel in its current state. Next, let's take a brief look at some of the weapon designs. Now, unfortunately, we are limited a bit here, as there's only a handful of weapons available in the beta, and almost none of the weapons available are shared with Battlefield 4. Though there are still a few similar weapon types that can give us a rough idea of how the models have been improved. Take this Glock handgun for example. Battlefield 2042's version of this classic firearm is significantly improved over its older counterpart, with much more detail in practically every area. The textured surfaces are crisper, the level of detail is increased, and the general animation quality for firing and reloading has also been improved a great deal. The AK-12 also makes a return, albeit in a slightly different form. In Battlefield 4, the prototype version of the AK-12 is utilized, with smaller spacing between the grooves along the top rail, and a less detailed receiver. In 2042 though, we're given the final production version of this same weapon, given the name AK-24 in-game. The core structure of the weapon remains intact, but we can see wider spacing for the top rail, a different handguard with tan coloration, and much more detail along the barrel and receiver. And this is kind of the case with every weapon in the game. Each firearm in 2042 is some sort of modern weapon given a fake name with a lot more detail. And because more gaming PCs and consoles today are capable of actually running these games at high resolutions like 1440p and 4K, the developers have made sure to make even the smallest details clearly visible. Whereas before, these smaller details like etched serial numbers and insignias were barely legible. Next up, let's talk about the environment. Here's where we really see the advantage of nearly a decade's worth of incremental improvements to the Frostbite engine. 2042's orbital map is absolutely gorgeous, with some fantastic dynamic vegetation density, huge draw distances, and some impressive set pieces. The map itself is one of the bigger maps in the series, roughly twice the size of Battlefield 3's Caspian Border. Though, thanks to the increased player count, it also doesn't feel as empty as maps like 1942's El Alamein. Now, we'll of course talk about the implications of this change in a bit, but before we do, it's worth noting just how much more detailed the world itself is over this old 2013 classic. The texture quality and overall detail level of the maps in Battlefield 4 is looking surprisingly dated now, especially when stacked up against the newer 2042. The roads, the dirt, the grass buried under the 3D dynamic grass models, and especially the various rocks and boulders all look significantly more photorealistic than they appeared in Battlefield 4. The only surface that appeared better in Battlefield 4 at first glance was the bark along these palm trees. But upon closer inspection, it's clear that Battlefield 2042's texture quality is still vastly superior. The world just looks and feels more realistic this time around, with even more of those great dynamic grass objects and trees all swaying realistically in the wind and directly reacting to the actions of players. And all of this is brought out even more thanks to the improvements made to the lighting design. The lighting in 2042 is probably the best it's looked in the series so far, with some nice implementation of the same third-party Enlighten technology that's been coupled with the series for over a decade now. Because of its implementation, the lighting is still static, only changing to preset configurations under certain circumstances. But even with this dynamicism, the lighting will always appear the same way every time. This valley, for example, will always bask in sunlight when there isn't a storm, and will never get covered by cloud formations or anything like that. Similarly, these areas that are cast in shadow during the storm will always remain in shadow, even if there are other areas where light seems to be peeking in through the clouds. Now, despite all the lighting effects being technically static, the general look and appearance is nothing short of impressive. The series has struggled for years to really lock down a realistic color tone without relying on intrusive screen filters to accomplish it. And while there's certainly areas where 2042 can feel a bit flat, there's other times where the presentation comes off feeling more lifelike. The screen space reflections along the various puddles and water surfaces look particularly good, and are a massive improvement over the practically non-existent reflective surfaces in Battlefield 4. Though again, this is an area that's been gradually improving for years now, with both Battlefield 1 and Battlefield 5 offering some beautiful lighting designs, that in some cases even look better than what's on display here. But we'll save that comparison for when Battlefield 2042 is officially released, so we have more maps and samples to compare. Battlefield 2042 also features improved shadow quality over BF4, with players projecting their own shadows and various environmental shadows feeling more prominent and detailed. The shadows in 2042 still aren't great, as I found a lot of really bad dithering and edge shimmer, especially from the character model's own hat along the surface of their weapon, but it's still technically an improvement over Battlefield 4's almost non-existent shadows. Finally, there's effects. This is another area where Battlefield 2042's presentation really shines, as there's a lot of really big improvements in practically every area. The explosions, for example, now look like real explosions, with a realistic fireball coupled with hundreds if not thousands of particle effects, and far superior smoke simulation to round it all out. The explosions in Battlefield 4 haven't aged quite as well, with what looks like a big bright orange cloud of fire quickly fading into a short smokestack, with only a few particles visible at any given time. The worst part of the effect is the strange-looking orange fire that appears at the center towards the end, that doesn't look even remotely as good as the yellow fireballs emitted in 2042. All that being said, 2042's explosions aren't perfect. One issue in particular that stands out is the complete lack of dynamic lighting from the explosion. something that BF4 very clearly demonstrates. Having light emit from this fireball and bounce off the environmental surfaces and the player's weapon model would serve to better integrate the effect into the world. Water effects are another area that look immediately more impressive in 2042. The ripples along the surface look incredible, and this, coupled with the specular lighting and high-quality textured surfaces of the sandy beaches, really help to sell a realistic-looking image. But there's still a few issues here. First, the screen space reflections being used look terrible at times, with a really pixelated appearance at certain angles. Then there's the dynamicism of the water itself. This just appears to be broken at the moment, with the ripple effect from swimming and shooting only appearing occasionally, as opposed to every time like in BF4. On the bright side, Battlefield 2042 does feature a nice wet shader effect for the player's hands and weapon model after emerging from the water, which is a nice attention to detail. Moving on, we have Battlefield's big claim to fame, its destruction. Destruction, as of late, has been weirdly downplayed in the Battlefield series, with some really nice dynamic destruction in BF1 and 5 barely being promoted despite improving a great deal over 3 and 4. Battlefield 2042's orbital map doesn't necessarily provide players with a lot of opportunities for destruction, mainly because most of the map is just open terrain and massive concrete structures. But I did find smaller destruction effects to be a big step up. Shooting concrete walls, for example, produces some really impressive particle density and alpha effects, something that Battlefield 4 really doesn't deliver as much. And craters formed by explosives seem to be more common than before, with rocket pods from helicopters completely deforming the terrain in areas of the map, and giving players new, reliable sources of cover. There's even some impressive terrain deformation when driving vehicles, with grass getting crushed by tanks and muddy roads forming deep tire tracks as the player drifts by, aspects that were not offered in BF4 in any discernible way. Then of course, there's the epic scripted destruction previously known as Levolution. In Battlefield 4, Levolution was introduced to present game-changing moments where something huge would happen to reshape the flow of the action. Siege of Shanghai had the tower collapse, Paracel Storm had the battleship crashing into the beach, and Flood Zone had the alleys flood to the point where players need to swim or drive boats. 2042 seems to be bringing this aspect back to the experience, with Orbital's massive rocket and its new dynamic storms. Only now, these events are completely unpredictable, something that I feel would have made the Levolution events in Battlefield 4 more interesting. In 2042, sometimes the rocket would launch early on in the match, sometimes at the very end, and other times it would completely explode on the platform, causing massive chunks of debris to litter the tarmac. The latter scenario seems to be more caused by the players hitting it with enough firepower, but it could also explode after being impacted by the even more epic Tornado, that will very rarely spawn during a match and cause absolute mayhem to ensue. Both the rocket and the tornado effects look incredible, and are easily 2042's most interesting new twist to the formula. And unlike Levolution and how often it would disrupt the flow of the action, these events feel random enough and interesting enough that they don't feel nearly as gimmicky. We'll of course still need to wait and see how this plays out in the other maps, but so far I think the Levolution type systems used in 2042 are a big improvement. In fact, collectively, the presentation of 2042 is a huge step up. But these improvements are all to be expected considering how much the series has evolved since then. What's even more interesting are the changes that have been made to the gameplay. So first off, let's talk about the elephant in the room, the Specialist system. In Battlefield 4, players have 4 classes to select between. There's the Assault, that serves as a frontline fighter with the option to equip medical supplies to heal and revive teammates. The Engineer, tasked with tackling hostile vehicles while also repairing friendlies. Support, who's all about suppression and ammo resupply. And Recon, intended for long-range sniping and scouting enemy positions. All 4 of these classes are purposely built to encourage specific team-oriented objectives, and also have their own signature class of weapons to help encourage players to choose that specific playstyle. It's a system that has been with the series since the very beginning, but interestingly, 2042 looks to be abandoning the class system altogether in favor of a more simplified Specialist system. With the Specialist system, players can select currently between 4 specialists, each with their own unique appearance, passive ability, and specialty device. The first specialist, McKay, serves as a sort of replacement for the old Assault class, as his passive trait gives him increased mobility, perfect for offensive playstyles. But he's also equipped with a new grappling device to zip around the map and climb out of reach areas. The next specialist is Boris, a sort of spiritual successor to the Engineer, who can deploy automatic sentry turrets and improve the effectiveness of other nearby sentry turrets. The third specialist, Casper, is a ghillie suit wearing recon unit, with access to a proximity sensor and a remote controlled recon drone, similar to the MAVs from BF3 and 4. And the fourth specialist is the game's medical support expert, that can revive any teammates with a defibrillator and also heal teammates at range using a Surette pistol. So far, it sounds pretty much the same as any other Battlefield game's class system. However, under this newer system, players can equip any weapon and any gadget regardless of which specialist they choose. If players choose to play as the medic, for example, they can grab a sniper rifle and a rocket launcher for their loadout. Likewise, a recon specialist can be equipped with a light machine gun and a medical crate. The idea seems to be to encourage that sandbox mentality, and while it's certainly nice to give players more options, this change introduces two fundamental problems to the Battlefield formula. One, teamplay mechanics are no longer being encouraged, and two, threat identification and prioritization is nearly impossible. So let's start with that first problem. The problem with letting players use whatever gear they want for whatever class is that now key team play oriented tools are less likely to be equipped. Nobody's going to choose to use a repair torch when the other option is a rocket launcher or a way to heal themselves. This is a big problem, as things like ammo resupply and repairs were already difficult to obtain from players whose sole job it would be to supply those services. If you end up running out of ammo on the field now, it's probably unlikely you'll find a player with an ammo bag equipped, and even more unlikely, they'll recognize that you need ammo and drop it for you. What's even more odd is they didn't even bring back the large ammo stations from Battlefield 5, so you can't just resupply yourself by going to a specific section of the map. Though you can at least pick ammo up off of dead enemies, which is a nice addition. I think making certain gadgets mandatory for certain specialists, like the repair tool for the Engineer and ammo for the support, would go a long way in improving the emphasis on team play. Though because of odd design choices like making the support class now function as the team's medic, there's several issues that would need to be addressed first before making this type of change. Then of course, there's that second problem, threat identification. This is sort of similar to what we just went over, but by making it so any player can carry anything, players now don't know exactly what they're dealing with. Let's say you're driving a tank, and are looking out for enemy AT soldiers looking to blow you up with rocket launchers. But because every specialist can equip an RPG, this could literally be any enemy in the game. A player wearing a ghillie suit, for example, could be holding a rocket launcher, and there's no way to know until he's already started firing. This is an even bigger problem when it comes to players using C4, or C5 as it's known in this game. In past Battlefield games, seeing a specific class running at your vehicle would indicate whether they were capable of blowing you up instantly with explosives. An assault class rushing you is often not a big deal, as they're never equipped with C4. But a recon class, or a support class depending on the game, was a totally different story, and would be cause for panic. In 2042 though, this is again a mystery to the player. Anyone can be holding explosives, so it's difficult to prioritize targets. And this issue extends to general infantry combat as well. You really don't know what kind of weapon the enemy may be fighting you with. A player wearing a ghillie suit originally could be identified as a sniper, so it's likely they were using a bolt-action rifle that you could probably outrun and dodge. But now, players using the Casper Specialist could just be wielding an LMG, and you won't know until it's too late. In short, there's just no defending the Specialist system in its current state. There's other specialists still yet to be revealed, but aside from having their own unique tools, there's really nothing about any of them that makes it worth scrapping Battlefield's most fundamental of gameplay structures. Moving on, let's talk about the weapon customization and general balancing. Aside from this specialist system, the way weapons are handled is more or less the same as it always has been. There's several different weapon categories, each with their own ideal configurations suited for certain playstyles. But instead of featuring a detailed weapon customization screen prior to spawning into the world like in Battlefield 4, Battlefield 2042 introduces the new Plus system. that, like Metro Exodus and Crisis, allows players to fully customize their weapon at any time while on the field. By simply pressing a button, players can toggle between several different attachments for 4 different areas of their weapon: the scope, the magazine, the barrel type, and the grip, each with helpful stat indicators and notes demonstrating what each attachment adds to the weapon's performance. It's a cool idea, as players can now change out scopes and barrels depending on their situation. However, it's also a little bit limited in its current state as well. It's unclear exactly how the system will work with the full game, as there seems to just be a random selection of attachments for each weapon in the beta. The SMG, for example, had a few different barrels to choose from and a suppressor, but other weapons didn't seem to offer suppressors at all. My guess is that with the final game, you'll be able to choose which 3 attachments you want to bring with you from each of the 4 categories, meaning there'll be just as many attachments as in BF4, if not more. As for the actual gunplay itself, I think 2042 is on the right track. The combat feels fantastic in this game from what I've played, with a short time to kill, great long-range accuracy, and satisfying kill confirmation sound effects. The user interface is a little problematic, and I'll expand upon that in a bit, but so far, the only weapons that don't feel as good are the sniper rifles. Considering how effective LMGs and assault rifles are in this game, it's surprising just how weak and useless the bolt-action snipers feel. The bullet velocity is way too low, making long-distance shots very difficult to execute. And to make matters worse, the damage dealt is so minimal that by the time you finish reloading, the enemy will likely have already found a way to heal themselves back to 100%. Snipers in Battlefield 4 feel more satisfying overall, with much clearer crosshairs and higher bullet velocity, making long-range engagements feel practical. Another strange change that's been made is to the grenades. In pretty much every Battlefield since Bad Company 2, grenades can be thrown instantly by either tapping or holding the grenade button. But Battlefield 2042 removes this quick throw option entirely, forcing players to switch to the grenade and then throw it separately, which certainly hurts the pacing of the action. Thankfully, the grenade itself feels nice and powerful, with high damage output and a decent radius. And because this particular map is so large, the grenade spam didn't feel quite as noticeable as it usually does. 2042 also reworks how melee kills are handled. In Battlefield 4, players can eliminate players using a flashy first-person takedown animation, dependent on the direction that the victim is facing. But in 2042, there's only a single takedown animation that is shown in third person, which is arguably not nearly as satisfying. If the player tries to melee attack in front of an enemy, then they'll instead just throw a punch, with multiple punches being enough to kill someone. It doesn't feel quite as polished as previous entries in the series, though it does seem likely that we'll see additional, more unique takedown animations with the final release. Next, I wanted to talk briefly about some of the changes that have been made to the available gadgets, starting with the defib paddles. The defib revive system has undergone dozens of changes since Battlefield 2, with many games making the tool a simple one-click trigger, while others tied in a full revive animation with set timers. In Battlefield 4, players could choose to instantly revive a teammate by clicking the shock paddles once, or they could press and hold to charge the paddles, bringing the incapacitated player back with full health. In 2042 though, the defib paddles must be charged to revive a player, and instead of being a separate tool, they're now context sensitive, requiring players to hold the interact key down when close enough to a downed player. This presents 2 problems as well. One, the interact key is the same key used to swap kits, so medics will often accidentally pick up a weapon instead of revive their teammate. And 2, the forced timer applied to the animation feels inconsistent, and resets if the player lets go of the button too quickly. This is a really clunky design for the revive system, as it limits the player's options, and makes reviving less intuitive than it ever has been. Other than that, most of the core gadgets function about the same as always. The medkit and ammo box have a new visible radius to indicate when a player is within range for them to function, and the C5 explosive has a funny randomized display message every time the trigger is pulled. But otherwise, these features should feel fairly consistent with their appearances in other Battlefield games. The only other gadget that I think could use some work is the rocket launcher. The velocity of the rocket projectile is too low to be used against any helicopters and jets like before. And what's worse, even if you do manage to master that rocket velocity, the damage dealt to these difficult targets is disappointingly low. A direct hit on a scout helicopter, for example, won't blow it up with a single hit. It won't even disable it. It will at least hold its own against armored ground targets like tanks, dealing anywhere between 25 to 35% damage depending on where you land a hit. But I feel landing a shot on a lightly armored aerial target should deal increased damage if possible, like it does in Battlefield 4. And that brings us to our next topic, the vehicles. Battlefield 4 featured a ton of vehicles, each built specifically to counter one another with the series' signature rock, paper, scissors formula. BF 2042 is built in very much the same way. Only now, because of the increased player count, there's a lot more of every vehicle in the field at once. This makes the airspace at any given time a wild spectacle, flares, rockets, and Gatling guns lighting up the sky, while tanks and scout vehicles duke it out below. It's quintessential Battlefield, and easily one of 2042's strongest aspects, as most of the vehicles in the game have a decent feel to them. Helicopters in particular have a really strong torque, allowing them to accelerate into a climb or drop almost instantaneously, whereas there's a bit of a gradual climb in Battlefield 4. You can also roll helicopters over and perform flips more easily, almost like the old Battlefield 2 days. But there's also a simplistic feel to them too, almost as if they've been toned down to be more accessible to newcomers. And the weapons included by default for the choppers, especially the scout helis, do feel a bit excessive. The scout helis not only get dual chain guns for infantry, but also rocket pods, making it almost a more effective chopper than the attack helis. I think reducing the number of rocket pods for the scout heli and improving the accuracy of the chain guns to coincide better with the player's crosshair would help to balance this vehicle out a bit more and make the attack helis feel more practical as a result. The jets, though, are even more problematic. They're easily the least effective vehicle in 2042. They feel terrible to fly, with really slow banking speeds and a weirdly cluttered first-person cockpit view. And they also feel wildly ineffective against the many choppers and VTOLs roaming the skies. So much so that dogfights with other jets is very uncommon. They do have a new air brake feature, which is a nice addition that's never been added before. But its limited maneuverability and weak armaments make it little more than a single-man transport to get across the map quickly. The VTOLs are one of BF 2042's biggest new additions. These behemoths seem to replace the standard transport helis from the past, and serve more as flying tanks, with lots of powerful passenger guns and a ridiculous amount of health. These can take several hits by AA missiles and will still fly straight. Because all vehicles use a auto-healing system after a long while, it'll take a dedicated squad of players several rockets to take down one. The ground vehicles are about the same as their Battlefield 4 counterparts. Tanks, for example, have the same great feel to them, with a really powerful cannon that's coupled with some nice sound effects. The AA tank feels okay in its current state, though its lock-on range is very far and can easily shut down an airspace if used properly. And while it does have low armor to help balance it out, I feel lowering its range by about 30% would help to make it feel a little bit more balanced. Then of course there's the scout vehicles that are more maneuverable and drift prone than the jeeps and trucks in Battlefield 4, and will fly off of ramps in an almost comically over-the-top fashion. But the biggest change up to the whole vehicle system is the way spawning works. Like with Battlefield 1 and 5, players are forced to spawn directly inside of vehicles from the deployment screen. This means there's no airfields or vehicle spawning locations at a base deployment. What's more, vehicles now have a new spawn cooldown timer, preventing players from consistently spawning in their favorite vehicle without letting someone else have a turn. This is a great feature, as this has been a long-running problem with the Battlefield series. Unfortunately, in its current state, the spawning rarely works properly. Spawning from the menu on a specific vehicle sometimes just spawns the player as a soldier at a completely random objective. Additionally, using the new deployment tablet to call in a vehicle drop almost never works, and it's not clear why certain vehicles are unavailable at times. Moving on, let's talk briefly about the user interface. This is an often overlooked aspect of the beta that I feel needs some serious work before release. The UI is a mess in its current state, with bugs causing some notifications to appear larger than they should, kill feedback either repeating itself or being delayed, and other anomalies like the wrong icons appearing for vehicles. But the biggest issues seem like intentional design choices that greatly impede the flow of the game. There's the size of icons, for example, that don't seem to adjust based on distance, making friendly players with a revive symbol appear closer than they actually are. Then there's the squad orders that can't be activated until the squad leader or members are already practically on top of the objective. Additionally, there's no way to zoom in or out the mini-map like before, or even a full overhead map at all, though the latter seems to just be a bug. And then there's just the overall style and design of the HUD itself, that feels overly large and intrusive, wasting screen space and contrasting too heavily with the action, especially the large banner notifications that drop down to demonstrate that a team has gained or lost majority. The scoreboard is also very difficult to read, with a lot of key information being weirdly hidden from the player that could otherwise be used to identify obvious hackers, high pings, and other key information. Even the series' signature comma rose is not available to use in this build of the game, with the developers stating that it may or may not be ready for the full release. It all just seems incredibly odd, as a lot of these elements have existed within the series since the beginning, and to not have basic functionality like being able to communicate with teammates or just viewing an overhead map is of particular concern, even if the build is 3 months old. But it's also possible that these seemingly more simple aspects of the game are prioritized in the later stages of development, and what we're seeing is most likely just placeholders for the design. Finally, let's wrap up with a brief sound comparison. Now, just a reminder, none of the weapons in 2042 are technically shared with Battlefield 4, at least not exactly. But by using similar weapon types in regards to their functionality in the game, we can at least determine a rough idea of how the sound has been updated with the latest release. So, what do you think? What game do you feel has the better sound quality and design? And that wraps up this episode of Direct Comparison. Overall, Battlefield 2042 is in a rough state. From a purely graphical perspective, it's a huge improvement. The world is gorgeously detailed, the lighting is great, and the visual effects are spectacular. There are a few areas that look rough, like the design of the character models, and a few of the weird graphical bugs and glitches, though it's nothing that can't technically be fixed by release. But the gameplay design is particularly concerning, as it seems to stray away from some of the series' most fundamental tenets. Team play and communication are key to what made games like Battlefield 2 such a huge success back in the day. So it's odd to me that, with this latest game, basic features like distinct class roles and a usable user interface were not given top priority when piecing this together. The specialist system just doesn't make any sense. It's not like their gadgets are all that unique either. We've had auto-sentry turrets and deployable shields in 2142, and they were tied to the support role as gadgets. But at the same time, those gadgets didn't replace the support's ammo box, as that was seen as a key aspect of the game's team play design, just as the repair tool and medical crate are. I think the easiest solution here would be to just give players 4 classes, each with key gadgets like ammo or health boxes that can never be unequipped. The specialist tools like the grapple and sentry turrets should be optional, as they aren't nearly as important to the flow of the gameplay. Certain primary weapon types should also return to being class-specific in order to aid in threat priority, and both factions should have specific skins, just like how the vehicles are already faction-specific. Without those changes, Battlefield 2042 just lacks the sort of structure that makes its wild sandbox actually work. It's a nice sentiment to give players the options to do whatever they want, but without any sort of backbone to it all, it ends up devolving into a complete unwieldy mess. But what do you guys think? Do you think Battlefield 2042 looks and plays good from what you've seen so far? Or do you agree with some of the concerns that I've brought up here? Let me know in the comment section. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more content like this posted every week.